Now, Ukrainian officials are expected to hold fresh talks with their US counterparts next week in Saudi Arabia, where an initial ceasefire with Russia is set to be discussed. Well, I'm now joined by the defence analyst Mick Mulroy, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence during President Trump's first term. He's also a former CIA officer and a former US Marine. Mick, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Aisha.
How do you interpret the words we just heard there from Donald Trump, saying that Putin is doing what anyone else would do? I mean, to the untrained ear, that almost sounds like he's sort of justifying the increase in attacks on Ukraine. What's your take on it?
Well, of course, Putin shouldn't be doing any of this, right? I mean, it was essentially a completely unprovoked and unlawful war. I guess you could say that as you go toward a ceasefire negotiation, you want to be on the strongest position. Yes, I think if you're just strictly speaking militarily, then that is accurate. But the other problem with that is the U.S. just cut off not only, as you said, military assistance, but also intelligence to include imagery, which does put Ukraine at a significant disadvantage when it comes to their own defense. So not only would Putin be doing this to try to gain some kind of advance before these negotiations, if he considers even going into these negotiations, but he probably will take the advantage of the fact that Ukraine right now is somewhat blind based on our withdrawal of intelligence.
And that's exactly the word that a major in the Brigade of Armed Forces of Ukraine used. He told the BBC that the removal of this very precious US intelligence means that it's now fighting blind. And one of our listeners, Mick's just messaged in saying, please ask your guest, do you think Trump is wanting to force Ukraine to surrender to Moscow, but by cutting off the aid, but crucially cutting off the intelligence?
Well, I think there's some truth to that, right? I mean, I haven't seen a lot of reluctance on the side of Ukraine to enter into these ceasefire agreements. In fact, the original proposal by General Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine for President Trump, who's very capable, who used to be the national security advisor for the vice president, his original plan was a ceasefire where Ukraine did not concede territory, but essentially agreed that they couldn't take it back militarily. And there was a pause in the fighting where European forces would come in to ensure that it wouldn't restart. Every indication that he's given is he's okay with that plan. Every indication that the Russians have given is they're not okay with that plan. They've summarily rejected peacekeeping forces enter, especially European, into Ukraine, which means that they could easily restart the war again. So all the reluctance I've seen on this issue of ceasefire negotiations is coming from Russia, but all the pressure seems to be going against Ukraine, especially from the United States.
And, Mick, just with your experience, and you've worked closely with Donald Trump in his first term, and, you're a former intelligence officer, you've been on the ground as well. I mean, what does the military man in you think of all of this?
Well, I think it's important to point out that most analysts like myself were debating between 3 days and 3 weeks for how long Ukraine would be able to sustain itself against a completely overwhelming force in Russia, one we actually overestimated. But now we're over 3 years, and Russia's only taken 20% of Ukraine, and Ukraine's actually taken certain territory in Russia. So I think it's important to point out not only how underestimated Ukraine has been, but also the willingness to fight for their own survival, really, as a military man, as you say, inspires me, quite frankly, and I give them the ultimate respect, and I think most do when they see just how willing they are to stand up for everything they have and give it all. So that to me necessitates, from my perspective, the U.S. standing with them. I mean, they are a democratic country. They're a long-term partner of the United States, and quite frankly, the United States and the U.K. Granted them security assurances when they gave up their nuclear weapons in 1994 after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I think we have a moral and, quite frankly, our integrity's on the line if we not only don't support them so they can win, which I think would be the argument against how the Biden administration acted, but now we're withholding their ability even to defend themselves. which I think will not go down well in history.
And I can sort of reading between the lines of what you're saying, and you're somebody who served under Donald Trump in his first presidency. Are you disappointed at how Donald Trump and his team have handled this? Because, I mean, certainly on this side of the pond, that there's just a lot of, people are still trying to process the fact that it looks like when it comes to Ukraine, President Trump's language has been all about stick, and yet with Russia, it looks like it's all been about carrot, in terms of giving Russia what they want. And now, as you say, this withdrawing of aid and the cutting off of the intelligence. Are you disappointed with how President Trump's behaved?
So I am an apolitical person, like a lot of people in the CIA and the military, if not all the people in the CIA and the military. So I view this issue to issue. I think there's a lot of things that the Trump administration did right, particularly when it comes to Iran, and we'll see if that carries through, and a lot of things that President Biden and his administration did right and wrong. But on this issue, I think it's very clear that it's in the United States' national security interest, not only to support Ukraine to the full amount, to essentially do so to get Russia to the negotiation table. I think we should be talking about doubling security assistance to Ukraine if Russia doesn't come to the table. And I think our European partners should as well. And I also think the United States, yes, and President Trump has certainly been right about this, is right to say that NATO countries should have been taking care of their own national security much more than they have been for the last 3 years instead of relying on the United States. But I'd also counter that it's the most significant military alliance in history, and it is mutually beneficial to all countries, especially now that the European countries are spending a lot more on their own defense. It has become even more important for the United States to be part of that. And unfortunately, there's even conversations that we're going to withdraw.
Yeah, and I think you just make a really important point there. It's, I think the one thing which is true is that Europe has been forced to step up its defence spending. We're having big conversations here in the UK. But I think what's really important about what you've just said there, Mick, is that this is an alliance which is mutually advantageous and mutually important. And I think one of the things that a lot of people, this side of the pond felt quite stung by was a kind of an insinuation that we're all sort of freeloaders in this relationship and junior partners and have not pulled our weight, when actually we have lots of servicemen and women who went to support America in the war against terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we had our body bags coming back with young men and women. And it is important to make that point that both countries have supported both countries throughout time, right?
Absolutely, Aisha, and that's a very good point to make, and it seems to have been lost on a lot of those that are claiming that our European partners have basically, like you said, freeloaded. It's not the case. The only time Article 5 has been used by the United States, and countries in NATO came to our defense, and a lot of them lost soldiers, as you mentioned, in Afghanistan. I served in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and I served alongside them. And they stayed, as you know, for 20 years. So it is hard to see how anybody could say that this alliance has not served the United States. And of course, collectively, this alliance was the primary reason why we won the Cold War. So it is really unfathomable to think the United States would pull out of this. We will essentially, what I argue with my colleagues here on both sides of the aisle, if we do pull out, then we're going to have to increase our defense budget to potentially $1.5 trillion, because that's what we would lose from our collective defense if we don't have the treaty organization in place with our European allies. It just makes no sense. From the U.S. side, if you just look at it from the America first mentality, this is America first. I'm not part of that group, but I would say that this is America first. This is in our own interest, both in support of Ukraine, every dime we send to them. If you look at it, its strength, right, it's all relative. So if our strength is here and Russia goes down, then our strength is relatively more significant than it was before. And that is what everything we're spending, and as well as the UK and European countries, they are willing to fight Russia, they are significantly depleting their military capability. It's almost astronomical. Any other country in the world would not be able to sustain this. They simply don't care about the loss of life of their own citizens.
Well, look, Mick, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your time. That's Mick Mulroy, who was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defence during Donald Trump's first presidency. He's also a former CIA officer and US Marine.